It's been 2 years since I worked maintenance in two really shady apartments in Birmingham, Alabama. I had made so many poor choices and my life was at rock bottom. $200 a week and a terrible apartment. Not bad for a struggling drug addict, I suppose. I'd been working with the Nashama apartments for about 3 months when I met Tony. He was an average height, late 30s, early 40s, Native American man. He kind of came out of nowhere, but that's not uncommon in that kind of living situation. He dressed nicer than most in our situation, but other than that, he seemed normal. Now, these apartments are under code, at best. Their whole purpose is to get the homeless off the street, so I was grateful for what little I had, but these units were in such terrible shape that Tony and I's job of maintenance is almost comical. Tony was very skilled in flooring and plumbing though, and he was a pretty funny guy. Real quiet, but he'd make quips every now and then, and with a northern accent too. Over the next 2 months, Tony and I became friends. Well, if you can call it that. We worked together though, lived next door to each other, and also used together. You see, Tony was very reserved until he did a line. Then he'd start opening up and he'd start talking about an Indian mafia up north and North Midwest. He talked about how he was born into it, and I've got to be honest that I was high and so was he, so I started laughing because it sounded ridiculous and I was pretty sure that it was a joke. However, I'll never forget the look on his face and his eyes. It was this dead stare with like a slight smirk, like he was somewhere else reliving something, and it was honestly terrifying. I said, "Hey, man, if you ever need to talk." And he said, "Nah, man, it's fine. Another life. Let's go get some soft." So we call up dude and went to meet him up the hill like usual. The guy's cousin called back and said that the dude got hemmed up and then he hung up. Tony said, "Well, I know this other guy," and he proceeded to call him up. And as the guy rolls up, I kind of had this feeling in my stomach. Something just wasn't right. Now, Tony had our money and was leaning in the car, and that's when I heard Tony yell, "Nah, screw that," and the guy tried to peel off. Tony had a death grip on this man, dragging him through the driver's window, and Tony screamed, "You trying to stiff me, huh?" And he hit this man so hard that I swear that he was trying to punch through his face. He wouldn't stop, and blood and flesh mixed with gravel on the ground just was everywhere. I screamed for Tony to stop, but he just yelled, "Check his pockets." I said, "I've got it, man, let's go, please." And his face and his eyes, he just looked possessed. And with one more kick to this broken man's head, we fled into the dark. I shouted at him with tears in my eyes and asked him why he did that. I told him that I was a white guy and he was a Native American and we were going to stick out, that they're going to kill us and they're going to find us. And he was like, "They won't do that. I punked him out. Besides, he didn't see you. And if he comes around again," and he flashes his 9mm, "I'll do him." He said this with a cold matter-of-fact tone in his voice. The tone just sent chills down my spine too. I'd never met someone as terrifying as Tony in my life. The next morning, he told me a bit more, still coked out, mind you. And without saying too much, Tony told me that he worked in a series of Native American casinos, as some who dealt with loans and collections, if you couldn't pay up, that is. Tony and another like Tony would show up and handle it, apparently. He then said that things are different on the reservations. That's what people don't get, as he took a sip of beer. I'm not going to lie too, I must admit that I was pretty fascinated with his stories, and I mean, come on, they must have been just stories, right? Over the next few months though, my worry that someone would come for us settled down some, and we moved on with life, just fixing up apartments, doing drugs, rinse and repeat. Until one day we're working on a sink, kind of tweaking a little, and up until this point I would listen to his stories with a childlike wonder. But on this day, he told a story that honestly kind of made me feel sick. He told me about this social security scheme that basically consisted of him and his bosses cashing social security checks off people that had cashed in their souls. He said we had 6 going until it started falling apart. Someone tipped off. The drunk tenant then says, "Are you guys all finished?" Tony smiled and said yes while cleaning up his tools. He smiled and walked out right by me, and I was kind of stunned from what I just heard. If he was telling the truth, then he was a cold-hearted monster that was also on the run. And if he's lying, then he's incredibly messed up in the head. But at 3 a.m. that night, I found out. I was woken up by the loudest bang that I'd ever heard. After the bang, a flood of blinding lights filled the entire apartment complex. A lot of shouting from outside. I didn't know what the heck was happening. I yelled out to my elderly roommate, "What's going on?" I ran to the front door and opened it to an armored US Marshal and a sea of blue lights. The Marshal told me to get back inside now sternly with a rifle pointed down towards, but definitely in my direction. And so, I didn't argue, and that's what I did. Seeing cops rush our apartment complex is nothing new, to be honest, but this was the most intense one that I'd ever seen. The next morning when I came outside, I noticed that Tony's door had been smashed in. I went to the apartment manager's office and I asked what happened last night, and she proceeded to tell me that Tony had been on the run for a while and had somehow fooled his way into a government-funded HUD apartment complex and job with said government-funded apartments, with some sort of an assumed identity or something. But then she turned to me and said, with a sort of shocked look on her face, "Tony, he hurt a lot of people." And every hair on my body stood on end, and all I got out was, "Oh." I'm not much for conspiracies, but there was nothing on the news about this arrest. I can't find anything on the people about it, and then again, it's pretty embarrassing that a state-funded homeless program let in an on-the-run fugitive and then paid him to work maintenance. So I can kind of understand the radio silence, I suppose. I only mention this, though, because we had a murder on the apartment grounds. By the way, this guy was also on maintenance. And what little news that there was so incredibly vague that you'd never really know where they were, and they were really careful not to mention that they were HUD houses. And so, in the end, I guess the moral of the story is you never really know what's going on in the head of the man that is right next to you. When I was 15, I was going to a school that was back-to-back with the town cemetery. There was even this small passage to it. It was near the school's football field, and people may need to access the cemetery for reasons that you'll understand in a minute. And in my country, you can be enrolled in a school in any of the 3 shifts, morning, afternoon, or evening. I was enrolled at night. Now, one night, during physical education class, we were playing football and the ball ended up in the cemetery. It was almost time to go home, and my group started an argument about who would have to go and get the ball. But me, being kind, wanting the discussion to end soon, and since I was not afraid, unlike many of those involved, I go off to the cemetery. I go to the passage to the cemetery, open the little gate and squeeze through it. The gate is big enough for me to just crouch through. One of my colleagues was in charge of holding the gate open, but when I passed through the gate, he closed it and started laughing. But as the cemetery was well lit, I didn't think too much of it, except that he was doing something childish. The ball was about 15 meters from the gate though, so I casually walked over to it and picked it up. When I looked forwards, I saw one of the most bizarre things in my entire life. A man was lying on top of a granite tomb, while another was taking a dump on his bare chest. I froze, because, what the heck, right? I turn around and I just start walking to the gate, pretending like I saw nothing, and while I walked the 15 meters, I began to hear steps behind me. I turned to look, and the 2 adult men were now walking towards me. I arrive at the gate and call my friend, telling him to open it, but all I hear is laughter in the distance, probably near the class block. I call even louder, and a girl who heard me opens the gate, but in the meantime the two men arrive to me. One grabs my jacket by the sleeve and starts to drag me. I looked at the girl when they started pulling me, and she made a horrified face and closed the gate. I thought that she was going to call the teacher or alert someone. I expected her to go, but after 5 or 10 seconds, I realized that she was just pretending that nothing was happening, and I was alone with these two degenerates in a cemetery after 10 p.m. They dragged me near to the grave where I saw them, and one of them, a drunk guy, started talking in a drunk voice. And he said, "What did you see?" I said, "I didn't see anything." And he was like, "Come on, what did you see?" I said that I didn't see anything again, I swear. And the drunk guy at this point starts to get violent, still holding me by my jacket sleeve, pulls me closer and speaks in a more serious tone. Before, he seemed to be sort of kidding. And he says, "Say it once, what did you see?" Me, not knowing what to do, I say, "I saw him taking a dump on your chest." The other guy looked like a drug dealer. He had all the red flags that a drug dealer would have. And when I said that he was doing this on the drunk guy's chest, he pulled a knife on me. It wasn't a small one, too. It was only a little less than the length of his forearm. I instantly began to shake, and he started talking while pointing at me with his free hand. The guy taking the dump says, "I remember your face, and if anyone finds out what happened, I'll find you and I'll cut you to pieces." I was so scared that the only thing that I managed to gather courage for was to mumble something about going back to school, and I promised that I'll never say anything about any of it. They let me go, but at no time did they put the knife away. I went back to the gate and once again called for someone to open it. My colleague who closed the gate on me for the first time was the one who opened it. I instantly punched him in the face. He fell down, put his hand on his face, and asked why. And I said, "You should have opened the gate." And I walked away, delivered the ball, and I went to the classroom to gather my things. When leaving school, there was easily 200 to 300 students leaving at the same time, parents picking up their children at school, but I lived 2 kilometers away, and so I used to walk home. It wasn't really a dangerous place, and we never heard of any case of crime being committed with a student or anything. I was still completely terrified, obviously, of what had happened to me, but I couldn't tell anyone. On a normal day, the first part of the walk home was fun. I walked part of the way with 4 of my friends, and on the way we would play and talk, but they lived between 800 meters to 1 kilometer from the school on the same street, so I kind of delivered them to their respective homes in a sequence and then walked the rest of the distance. Again, on a normal day, that kilometer alone was no big deal. The way home was generally well lit, and I passed busy places, sometimes bought a snack at those places, but on that day, I just wanted to leave, and I walked with my friends over to their house, barely participating in the conversation, which was unusual, and started my little 1 kilometer journey home. Now, I don't know if anyone else can say that they've already felt it, but there is something different about when we're scared. We're just more alert, right? On the way home to my house, I passed 3 bars and a church, and the rest of the way was on a street that had a soccer field on the corner and a nursery afterwards, both closed at the time, obviously. So that was definitely the worst part of the way home. I'm passing in front of the nursery just after passing the football field when I hear the sound of footsteps stepping on leaves, then on concrete, then leaves again, alternating in a pattern. There were parts of the sidewalk that had concrete floor and others that were just dirt and leaves. Again, though, when we're scared, we are way more aware of everything, and I ended up realizing that someone was walking where I had just walked. They were the same sounds that I had heard a few seconds ago, and it was almost like deja vu. I look back, and you can probably guess that the 2 men are walking very fast towards me. I don't even think this time, and I'm running at full speed before I know it. Not in the direction of my house, but just straight ahead. I run a block and arrive at the border of the city. My house was near the end of the city. I make a turn to the left, and this time I start heading home. There are still 3 small blocks to my house, and when I look back again, they are running after me. I start to stumble because the street was not paved and I almost fall, but this is enough for them to start reaching me. I turn left again, this time on the street that I live in. I reach my gate and it's unlocked. I go in and barely close the gate back. But when I get to my door, they're trying to open the gate. I go in and lock the door, but they open the gate by this time and then they start walking around my house. I take out my cell phone and I start calling the police immediately. My mum starts to panic without knowing what's going on. My sister, who was already asleep, wakes up. My brother leaves his room to ask what's going on. I explain between breaths that basically the two men started running after me and that I'm calling the police and that they're in the yard. As I call the police, I look out the window and see one of the men. It's the drunk guy. I panic even more. The 911, not the actual number here, obviously. A guy starts to talk to me and asks what's going on. I start feeding him info, and while I'm speaking to him, the other guy started trying to kick the back door open. Luckily, it was a very sturdy door with multiple locks, and he couldn't do anything to it. I start to talk to the operator to send someone soon. There are people in my house, and I think they want to kill me. He tells me that when I told him the situation and the place, that he had already sent a vehicle, and what I needed to do now was, when the police arrived, to help them. So I start describing the drunk guy, who is the only one that I see. I start walking around my house trying to see the other through the window. I catch a glimpse of him and immediately knew who it was. I give the description that I remember from the cemetery. Luckily, I actually lived near a prison, so there were always police cars nearby, and in less than 5 minutes, they were at my house. Both guys tried to jump over the wall to the neighbor who lived behind me. The police followed them and actually managed to catch them, but somehow they escaped. I heard they found them later somewhere else and that he was questioned by the police and then let go because of lack of evidence or something. But the guy that was actually taking the dump ended up in jail for trespassing on private property and also illegal possession of a gun. Apparently, he had a .22 revolver and the knife with him as well. The police said that he had actually used some hard drugs. The story about the cemetery got to everyone eventually that I knew, and about a year later I found through a not law-abiding friend that the dude was actually killed because of a rebellion that happened in prison, which is 10 blocks away from my house. To this day, I can honestly say that I've never been so scared in my life. I still live in the same house, but by myself. My family moved out. And I'm still pretty afraid that someday that drunk guy is going to try and get revenge on me or something. Anyway, I know it's a bit of a weird and sort of random story. I know it's pretty disturbing as well, but it actually happened, and I sure hope that I never see that guy again. This is a culmination of experiences involving a friend that I grew up with. When we were 15 years old, my friend, Bob, a mutual friend, and I wandered out to a house that was abandoned. We grew up in the middle of nowhere, and the house was about 2 miles from any roadways. We get to the house, and he takes pictures with his camera of the house. We wander around inside and then go into the basement. As we walk into the basement, I'll see a small child there. This kid has to be about 3 or 4 years old. We all say something about it at the same time. There was a small wood burner that the kid disappeared behind. We walk over and nothing. Nobody's there. The walls are solid and there's nowhere a kid could have gone. So we all just sort of silently filtered outside, and the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. And quite honestly, I've never run so far or so fast in my life. The experience really bothered me, and I didn't speak about it for a couple of years until things started to escalate. So fast forward a couple of years, all sorts of friends and acquaintances have strange experiences around Bob. No one ever talks about them though, and everyone's just too uncomfortable to bring them up. Until one night when we went to a bonfire. Several of us went to eat dinner, Bob to the bonfire. The whole ride we can see Bob's girlfriend next to him in his car. We get to the bonfire, pulling up next to him, and he's alone in the car. His girlfriend had driven herself and pulled in on the other side of our car, and the kid who drove us gets out and says, "Hey Bob, the craziest thing just happened." He proceeds to tell Bob. Bob turns pale white and says, "I need to go home," and just hops in his car and speeds off. We all wander off to the fire, and we're all quiet for about an hour. The other few people ask everyone what's wrong, and finally one of my friends says, "I don't know where to begin." So he slowly tells the story of the ride over, then follows up with a story about seeing his dead mother walk across his driveway one night the year before when Bob dropped him off after a basketball game. Around the circle, everyone has a story that they can't explain. A couple of people had seen deceased relatives. Some people had been alone with Bob and heard another person talking, but nobody was there. And it just got more and more unsettling, and we all headed out rather early. About a year later, I visit Bob's house, and we're talking about college and plans since we've graduated. In the middle of our conversation, I see a book sliding off of his bookshelf out of the corner of my eye. It falls and pops open. I look at the bookshelf, and the front end is elevated so the books sit angled with the tops towards the wall. Bob then yells, "For heaven's sake, they're restless," picks the book up, slams it shut, and puts it back on the shelf. I decide to ask some questions at this point, and I bring up all the things that I'd seen. I also spoke about things other people had experienced, and he frowned. And then he tells me that his grandfather was a church pastor, and when Bob was 6, he went to a house where his grandfather was supposed to perform an exorcism. Bob claims that he was scared stiff because the girl who was claimed to be possessed came floating down the stairs, hovering above the ground, and he said that ever since that night, he sees and hears people that no one else can hear or see. He was very visibly upset about it. But we talked some more, and I had no idea what to say. I didn't honestly think that he was crazy, and I still don't, but I can't explain any of it. A couple of days later, though, Bob goes to his girlfriend's house to pick her up for a date, and she hears two people arguing outside. She looks out the window onto her porch and sees Bob arguing with a man. She opens the door, and Bob is now standing alone on her porch. She freaks out, and Bob breaks up with her on the spot. Over the next couple of weeks, Bob transfers to a college on the other side of the country and then just abruptly moves away without talking to anyone. For context, and more things that give me the creeps, I've now been a cop for 13 years, and I'm definitely an agnostic. I'm not one to believe much anything lacking facts or evidence. I can say this, though. I work in a city not far from where I grew up, and every time Bob comes home to visit his parents, the area departments have a huge spike in unfounded calls. People calling 911 to report intruders in their homes in numbers that are honestly frightening. Anyway, that could all be coincidence, I know, but Bob doesn't talk to any of us too often. The people who have had experiences still talk about it, and still, no one knows what to make of it. I've had other bizarre experiences that I honestly can't explain, but nothing as profound as being in Bob's presence. And oddly enough, once Bob moved away, everything just stopped. The other experiences, though, only happen when he's in town. So yeah. Anyway, I feel like I need a drink after typing all of that out. So I hope you enjoyed. This happened about 3 years ago, 2016 to 2017-ish, when some friends and I went hiking on the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina, close to Boone, but still a good 30 minutes drive from the start of the trail. We get in a few hours before we start to make camp so that we could beat the time and enjoy the mountain scenery at dusk before it gets dark. We set up, tie our food and things to the tree, roll a couple of smokes, crack open a few, and enjoy the mountain face overlooking the valley. Truly, the Appalachians are just gorgeous. And then we hear it. There's just this blood-curdling scream out of nowhere. It seemed to come from our east, opposite from our campground and the trail. We all immediately freaked out, with a couple of us yelling out and one or two pulling out their pistols. We all just sort of stand there frozen for a second when we hear it again, and then silence. It was like that horror movie silence when everything, like the trees and the birds and the wind, just stops. You could hear everyone breathing like it was against our ear, and none of us had cell service, and it was way too dark to make our way to anything like civilization. So the four of us just sort of holed up together without sleeping until daybreak. Still a bit freaked, we made our way back to our cars in the parking lots. The trail kind of buckles and intersects at times in this area too, so to get back we had to come close where we heard the origin of the scream. And lo and behold, we found in the trail cougar tracks. We hurried back and contacted the local ranger station to let them know, and the ranger just sighed and said something to the effect of, "Yeah, you're not the first this week to tell us." So bottom line, those big cats, they ain't gone just yet. This happened to me about 30 minutes ago. I'm driving to work and it's about 3:30 in the morning. I take 3 different routes to work, but I've been taking the same one for a while since there's construction everywhere else. I'm driving down this road and on the other side of the road is subdivisions. I'm listening to a podcast, trying to keep myself awake until I can get some coffee. I start getting this uneasy feeling in my stomach, but I thought it was my body telling me to get some caffeine and maybe something to eat. I ignore it and continue driving. When all of a sudden, this guy starts running out in the middle of the road. I barely see him since he's wearing dark clothes, and I managed to slow down and notice that he looked pretty freaked out. Now, I listen to a lot of podcasts about creepy stuff, ranging from true crime to supernatural, and I know the rules to stay safe in these sorts of situations. I normally wouldn't stop, but I knew that if something had happened to me, I would also want someone to stop for me, so I did. Luckily, I kept my car running and rolled down my window just a little bit so I can talk to this guy. I asked if he's okay, and he started freaking out saying someone was trying to kill him. He told me that his dog was ripped apart in his front lawn and he tried to pick up the remains to try and bury it, but he saw a man running after him with a knife. He said that he thought it was probably a coyote or something at first, so he wasn't suspicious, but he ran off when he saw the man. Now, I was pretty freaked out, but it was about this time that I noticed something. Yes, it was dark, but with the lights on inside of my car, and the lights that were on out front of the subdivisions, I could see pretty well. He was younger, about mid-30s, dark black hair and green eyes. He was wearing a hunter's jacket and jeans. I live in Idaho, so hunter's jackets are pretty normal attire here. But what I noticed, however, was there was no blood or fur anywhere on him. I asked him why there wasn't any blood on him, and his whole demeanor changed instantly. It was honestly like turning off a switch, and my blood went cold. He stared at me for what felt like minutes, but it was probably only a couple of seconds. And what came out of his mouth next was the final straw for me. His whole body relaxed, he stopped shaking, and he leaned closer towards my window, smiled at me. It was a sort of twisted type of smile, and his eyes went sort of dim and dark. He took a deep breath and then said, "I was going to help you." He then started cackling and tried to open my door, and immediately I rolled up the window, put my car in drive, and sped off down the road. And I didn't stop for anything after that. Once I finally got to work, I started crying, and I still have 10 minutes before I have to go in, but honestly, I'm terrified to even get out. This is something that my sister experienced about a week ago, which was similar to an experience that a friend of hers had about a month before. So she was sleeping at her boyfriend's house, which backs onto a mountain with a forest starting in his backyard, when she decided to go and get herself some food from upstairs. Her boyfriend refused to go with her as he had school in the morning and it was already 1 a.m. His room is in the basement, so she went up the stairs to the kitchen, on the same level as the rest of the family's bedrooms. Because she didn't want to wake everyone else up, she just used her phone flashlight while she kind of prepared herself bananas and hummus and whatnot. And while doing this, she heard what sounded like large dog footsteps, but they don't have any pets, going to the bathroom, which she recognized as it was kind of squeaky. The door opened and closed about 3 or 4 times before finally closing. Then the footsteps progressed down the hall in her direction to a closet door where the same thing happened. Only this time, the door was left open. She tried to brush it off as just a family member and went back to chopping her banana. When out of the corner of her eye, she saw what appeared to be a very large black figure slowly lean its way around the hallway corner to look down into the kitchen. She looked up and it pretty quickly disappeared. The same thing happened again, only this time its neck stretched out longer to get a better look at her. She looked up again and caught a glimpse of something with white glowing eyes before it disappeared back around the corner again. At this point, she was freaked out and grabbed a knife. She quickly went around the corner to turn on the light, but there was no one there, and so she gathered all of her stuff and headed back downstairs. When she told her boyfriend in the morning, he told her that that closet door is not just a closet door, but it's an empty room with an attic door in the ceiling. They went in the room the next day and found that the paint had been scratched off of the attic door, and the floor was scratched to pieces beneath it. A friend of hers had a similar incident a month or so earlier when he was taking a leak in the backyard. He looked up to see a tall creature with what he described to be white glowing eyes and huge teeth standing amongst the trees. Once it noticed him, it ran off, but then started coming after him once he started running back towards the house. She's not entirely sure what it was, but whatever it was, she really hopes to never meet it.